Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Barbarian and this is Victoria 3's 12th dev diary. Today we have Treasury, and this is a really interesting one to me because today we have basically a mechanic that binds much or, maybe most of the mechanics that we talked about in previous dev diaries together, because this is all about money, and money both in Victoria 1, 2 and 3, is of course primarily about the topic, hey, this is your primary resource. Yes, we got other resources, officer points in Victoria 2, bureaucracy and so on in Victoria 3, but money is where it all comes together because that determines whether your nation, whether your state is failing or succeeding. So let's check this out. There are some really interesting changes, in particular compared to Victoria 2, but let's just talk about it. Specifically, we are going to be talking about income, expenses and debt and how they function on the national level. Money is one of the principal resources you have to manage in Victoria 3. This in itself is of course nothing new, but the way money works is a little bit different than what you might be used to. In most games, money tends to be a resource you accumulate for a specific goal until you have enough of it to achieve that specific goal. For example, you might want to build a building that costs 100 money and your monthly income is 10 money. That means in order to build said building, you have to wait for 10 months to accumulate the 100 money needed for the lump sum cost to order the construction of said building. That is, of course, correct basically for everything, CK2, CK3, CK1, Victoria 1, Victoria 2. You were looking at stuff like, Victoria 2, hey, if you want to build something, for example, that the capitalists are investing in, then you just need to invest a lump sum of money. They will buy goods from the market. Most of the time, it's not enough. That's just because the market price... It's really, honestly, if you haven't played Victoria 2, you don't need to know that, so don't worry about it. What I'm talking about is the idea that you invest money when you have it. That's what you do in most of the games that we have, when it comes to grand strategy, but also games in general. EU4, of course, also does it. StarCraft does it. I mean, okay. That's a bit different, I guess. Even so, in Victoria 3, there is no such thing as a lump sum cost. Instead, it's all about your weekly balance. At the end of every in-game week, your country's income and expenses are tallied up, and the result is then applied to your gold reserve or national debt. This also means that all forms of expenses, such as construction, also work on a weekly basis. You do not need any cash on hand to start construction of a dozen buildings at once, but if you don't have the revenue to support it, you may find yourself quickly going into debt. That is really cool. So we had some comments about this previously, and we're going to go into more depth here as we go, of course, but I really enjoyed the fact that we had some comments that acknowledged this. We had a discussion in the community that basically stated that going into debt is never beneficial in most of the games that we have. I mean, CK3, it's a straight negative. That is just the way it is. In EU4, you can certainly play with it, and there is certainly a playstyle where you succeed with it, but, in general, people stay out of the debt realm. In Victoria 2, quite frankly, I don't think I ever purposely went into debt. It happens, of course, when stuff goes bad, when I go to war and so on. I'm trying to think, and I'm trying to think about this. I don't think I ever purposely bankrupted myself. I don't think I ever purposely put myself into debt to begin with. But in Victoria 3, that's a bit different. Now, let's take a look at this. This is the United States, and may I just say, I had a lot of, basically, personal feelings about the map of Victoria 3. Feelings where I was like, I don't know how to feel about this. But this map in the background here looks really good. Looking at this, I'm actually a big fan of what I'm seeing. I like the mountains even. I think the mountain ranges looks, in a bit of an eccentric, in a bit of a strong view. I like this. I personally enjoy this greatly. I don't know, oh my god. No, that can't be what it... Okay, no, wait a minute. I didn't notice this before. So this is obviously, we have literacy. I mean, this may be a standard of living, something like that, the average one. This is surely the... Oh my god, does this actually mean it's a military zone? Like I described in my crackpot theory video? No way, right? 10 units of something? No goddamn way. Okay, you know what? Let's put that aside. Let's talk about the Treasury here. This is the United States of America. They don't have a general income tax, and here we get actually to something that is quite interesting because it was brought up by the comments, and that was the topic of state regiments, or rather state regimes rather, where you have a situation where a state in the United States might say, hey, we want an income tax. But this will only be proper in, I don't know, let's say New York, right? It won't be a thing in the United States per se. This is not a thing in Victoria 3 as it stands. Oh my god, if that actually, listen, if that actually means what I think it does, I am blown away and I would be so happy. We could graduate from microing armies like we do in all other games. Still micro them, but not micro them. Okay, listen, I'm sorry, my excitement is actually, I really hope that is what it is. What we have right here, we have poll taxes, we have consumption taxes, dividends taxes, minting, diplomatic pacts, money from the investment fund. Then down here we have the expenses, goods for government buildings, government wages, goods for military buildings, military wages, and new constructions. How these are actually, you know, sort of what the legend behind this is, what the meaning behind any of this is. We're going to get that at the end of the dev diary. They explain it a bit better. But generally what we see here is effectively this is our monthly revenue, and then this is our monthly expenses, and we either have a profit or we don't have a profit. In this case, of course, we have 16k. These are then invested into the gold pool, but we're going to take a look at that in a second. The investment pool, this is more interesting to me than the investment pool was on first glance. Since it is a weekly thing, we're actually looking at something. I mean, you can see it right here, that this is actually going up. I wonder exactly, this looks like a lump sum, but if it isn't directly a lump sum, it could mean that you invest this and by week, the investment pool will actually lose money rather than your national expenses losing that money, right? I'm not entirely certain about that, but you can see the balance graph here right now. The United States are doing great, but that is of course also because they don't really have that many investments at the same time. The gold reserve is your country's national stockpile of cash. If you're free of debt, any money that is left over in the weekly budget after expenses are subtracted. That is used to increase the gold reserve. Conversely, if your expenses exceed your income, this money is taken out of the gold reserve to balance the books. Though it's certainly never bad in itself to have a sizable gold reserve, it isn't necessarily the best idea to continually run a large budget surplus. Each country has a gold reserve limit, which is a soft cap, over which each surplus pound has diminishing returns on the gold reserve. If you have an enormous stockpile of gold, a surplus of 10k may only increase your stockpile by as little as 2k, meaning that you've simply wasted the rest of your money. Hence, a country that finds its gold reserves filling up may want to consider finding a way to reinvest some of that money to avoid such wastage. This is incredible, but depends on how it's implemented, on how it actually works in the reality of the matter. Now, what do I mean by that? Obviously, this sort of comes from the point of view, Keynesian, I don't know how, Keynesian? I don't know how to pronounce it in English, I have to admit. I only know that term in German, basically. But the idea that you would be investing a lot of money, maybe even go into debt when you have an economic crisis as the state, and then when there is, you know, you go back up, there's a surplus again, there's a boom again, you basically have to save money so that you can then counter the next crash. That is a fundamental idea. Of course, let's not talk about the correctness. You know, there's a lot of abstraction going on to begin with in Victoria 3. I think that is fine because you need a working system. But I like this idea that in good times, you will be building up your gold reserve, and of course at some point that gold reserve, you know, will reach that soft cap, because it's looking at a point of view where the gold reserve says, hey, we can't really buy more gold, it's a limited resource, and buying more is currently not a good idea, and that means that, you know, 10k becomes just a 2k gold surplus because buying that gold is so much more expensive. That is abstracted. I will say that there appears to be no gold resource per se, but there's of course a situation going on here where we have the benefit of saying, hey, this is the abstraction of basically the gold price increasing naturally because we're buying up so much with our gold reserve. I like this idea, and I like the idea that it basically says, yeah, you can build it up, but at some point the game and the world will say, maybe you want to invest some of that money in some of your state. And I think that is a great idea. That's a dynamic that we didn't really have in Victoria 2. There wasn't a differentiation between building up, being rich, and then going on. Somebody pointed out, and this is of course always valid, somebody pointed out that the UK, for example, that Great Britain in Victoria 2, in like 1900, basically had enough of a positive reserve that they could have been without any income for the rest of the game, and they could have financed themselves because they just had that much lying around. That will no longer be the case in Victoria 3 because the gold reserve does have a soft cap and you are incentivized to invest in the moment. Great stuff. Now let's talk about the Spanish gold reserve, and as you can see right here, the Treasury has a balance of 32k. The gold reserves are 1.74 million. The current reserves will increase, of course. Gold reserve limit is 1.5. Gold reserves is how much treasury your country has stored in their reserves. If you run a positive balance, you will increase your gold reserve and vice versa. I love the clouds so much. Oh, I love Ireland right here. Look at that. Excessive stockpiling of gold causes the gold price to rise. Your balance of 32.4k buys you the equivalent of only 23.7k worth of gold. I can't read, but this is good. I think this is good news, makes it so that you're incentivized to move on. Let's also take a look at the, yeah, these are definitely the rankings, 100%. I think originally I believe this to be basically like the tab that you have in CK3, but I'm pretty sure this is just the USA are a great power. Then we have Spain and number 9, so a medium power. I can't remember what the actual consensus there is, but also, can I just say, look at Spain. This looks great. Honestly, Maybe I'm warming up to the map. Maybe they changed what the lighting looks like. But I like these mountains. I really do. Let me know. Honestly, this is not the theme, not the topic of this dev diary, but let me know what you think of these mountains. I like them. I like them a lot. So, what if you're running a deficit and your gold reserve has all been tapped? Well, this is when debt comes into play. Beyond that point, each pound spent in excess of your income will result in automatically taking on debt. While this may sound like something that you should avoid at all costs, that isn't necessarily true. While you do have to pay interest on your loans, interest rates in Victoria 3 are relatively low, and so long as you avoid hitting your debt ceiling, growing your economy through deficit spending can actually be a very valid strategy. This is because the increase in revenues from minting and taxation may very well end up exceeding the interest payments, not to mention the benefits constructing new industries can have for your population. So this is, to a degree, basic economics. When you, it's a question of opportunity costs, right? Let me dive into this. When I take up a loan as a business or as a private person, and I have something where I say the interest rate of this loan is, let's say, 5%, and I have the idea that my business will be making basically a return of investment of higher than 5%, I will be making more money even when I'm paying back the loan with all of the interest there. I will be making more money because I'm looking at me having an opportunity with this borrowed money that I otherwise wouldn't be having. At the end of the day, if everything goes well, making it so that you come out ahead. Now, does that always work out? Certainly not, but that is the general idea, and that is the idea here. If you're in a situation where your economy is in the gutters, or everything is terrible, basically, you might want to invest money that you don't actually have, and then get the revenue, get the return from that money via taxes, via just a general prosperity in your society, and be able to pay back the loan and the interest at something that basically costs less than you make from your new investments. That's great stuff. That being implemented, I think, is absolutely valid. In most other games, loans are basically just the idea. And you can still, I mean, in CK2 you had loans, in EU4 of course you have loans, I mean in Victoria 2 you have loans, but let's get to that in a second. The way I see it basically when it comes to loans in Victoria 3 is that there is a genuine incentive that isn't just power gaming. In EU4, most of the time when you take loans, it is because you desperately know that there is, you know, something that you need to achieve, be it win a war, be it take a specific province, be it vassalize, or, you know, personal unionize, I don't know the actual term there, but bring somebody into a personal union, win a succession war, for example, right, that sort of stuff. There is stuff where you know this may be necessary, but you never say, hey, let's grow internally by me using loans. You just don't do that. And that is different in Victoria 3. In Victoria 3, you might sit down and say, hey, you know, we are currently in a crisis. My economy crashed because this idiot that got a treaty port from me made it so that my entire tools factories were completely demolished. Now, if I can withstand that guy and make it so that I can, you know, industrialize on my own, I might be able to actually come out ahead, even though I may be going into debt now. The debt ceiling, unlike the gold reserve, is not a soft cap. Once you hit it, your country will be in default, which is a terrible state to be in and can only be recovered from if you manage to slash your expenses enough to put your weekly expenses back in the black, or if another country steps in and takes on your debt, which can have its own undesirable outcomes for you, but more on that later. It is also possible to simply declare bankruptcy, but because the money you are borrowing against is actually the cash reserves of your country's buildings, which is actually what determines the size of your debt ceiling, this will have immensely negative consequences for your domestic industry. So, this one is a bit weird to me. Obviously, you take on loans, and you take those loans from various sources, and when you default on them, yes, that will impact your economy negatively. That is entirely correct. That is a basic assumption that makes perfect sense to me as well. What seems to go without mention here, and what seems to just not be a thing anymore, in Victoria 2, and it would happen mostly in the background, players would basically never interact with this on a direct level unless they were paying back loans, but where are the foreign loans? Where are the foreign investments that without a doubt could happen, especially in an open market? If I have a market, and I mean, you know, this could still happen under other circumstances, but if I'm in an open market, such as, I don't know, the Zollverein, so we're talking about Prussia and Bavaria, for example, and Prussia gives a loan to Bavaria, is this simulated? Because it doesn't sound like it's simulated to me. It could also have a ripple effect. I mean, let's go a bit further, I guess. Let's go at the end of World War I. We have a lot of war debt going on. We have a lot of debts towards the United States of America that handed out availabilities, that handed out money to recover the economy of the world. And then, at some point, people defaulted, people were unable to actually cash it in. You know, the actual story of Black Monday, of course, Black Friday, Black Monday, I'm pretty sure Kaiserreich is unironically messing me up here. One is Friday and one is Monday. The historical one, let me make a 50-50 guess. The historical one is Black Monday, I think. Now, the way I see it, basically the way it, of course, happened is you had a domestic debt crisis, and then that debt crisis was extended over the ocean. But can that be done in Victoria 3 at all? Because I will say, it doesn't sound like you can be the one in debt, you know, to another country. It doesn't sound that way at all, to that country's central bank or whatever. And I think that's a downgrade. I don't think that would be good. If that were the case, I would like to see the developers' takes on this. But yeah, either way, I hope that you get where I'm coming from there. But other than that, I will say, of course it makes sense. If you go bankrupt as a state, your economy will be impacted, and that will happen because your debt ceiling is essentially, and your cash reserves are essentially coming by borrowing against your actual, basically your GDP. So what your buildings are doing, how much wealth they have, how much prosperity they have, that much makes sense. I'm just not that certain that I like that there can't be regular state loans unless, you know, you get brought out of the debt by a different state. I mean, that sounds like it, you know, comes with political and economic responsibilities, but at the same time, why can't Prussia just say, hey, Bavaria, we're going to give you a state investment loan, you can invest in that, and then if Bavaria goes bankrupt, or rather if Bavaria suffers, that would mean the people that loaned the money to Bavaria from Prussia would go bankrupt, impacting the Prussian economy, maybe impacting other people that lended to Prussia. I'm just saying, I think that would be cool. It doesn't sound like it's in. Now, even though Britain has taken on several millions pounds of debt, this isn't too much of an issue. Their advanced economy allows them in a high debt ceiling, and the interest payments is only a small fraction of their spending. I don't know what it is today, but in previous screenshots, I did not like the UK. Oh, I'm an idiot, actually. No, this is totally the CK3 tab right here. This is the great power. This is the CK3 tab where you open it, you get the rider that says, you could do X, you could do Y, you could do Z. Right, so this still stands. Anyway, but yeah, look, I honestly like the map. You know what, let me, give me a second. I knew it. They definitely changed the lighting. Look at this. This is an early screenshot on the Steam page. I remember seeing this right when the game was announced. Look at this. And then, look at this. Look at the difference here. Seriously, this is a massive, massive difference. It might also have to do actually with the time of day, but I vastly preferred this. This looks so like actually really well shaded. This one on the other hand is like, yeah, I don't know. There's no... It looks so like one-dimensional. And then this one on the other hand, just look at that. Yeah, I vastly prefer the maps that we are seeing this dev area over the other maps. Now, let's take a look at this. We have the assets, and we have a pool here. So this is the investment pool. 76.2k. We have a principal debt of 2.07 million. Of course, there's interest on that. The principal here, I don't know why the interest is actually different. I'm not entirely certain about this. It looks to me like this number is correct and this is just rounded, because you can see there's one more behind the decimal point number, and it isn't here, but it's clearly represented here. I feel like this is just paradox rounding. Basically, the interest rate is 10%. You have a principal of 2.07 million. You pay 10% on that. Of course, you pay the interest loans, or rather the loans themselves back. I wonder why the investment pool is here. It would sort of mix this number, I guess, or match this number, but I can't see that being accurate. But what is the most important part of the screenshot, of course, is the actual credit limit. We can see we have a base of 100k, and then we have everything related to actually producing a credit limit. So, because we are so urbanized, because we have so many textile mills, because we have a livestock ranch, people trust that we can deal with loans. That we can deal and say, hey, we are in a situation where basically... our loans are, you know, we can service them, and you can trust that we can service them because we have such a big economy. We can tax that economy. We can take away subsidies. We can, I don't know, create more economies. Maybe sell, you know, some of this off. Something like that anyway. The national credit is the amount of money the government can borrow from domestic sources equal to the sum of all domestic cash reserves. Yeah, and here we are yet again. I actually feel like cutting out potential external debt, you know, loaners, basically, loan givers. I feel like that's a downgrade. I like this system per se. I think the weekly sort of, you know, look at your budget, I think that is great. I think it works significantly better, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, especially the United States, this is actually in the time frame of Victoria 3. Obviously, you know, they gave out loans, they did all that stuff, but I don't know what to think about that. To wrap up this dev diary, I'm going to briefly touch on the main forms of income and expenditures, though this is by no means an exhaustive list. Some forms of income and expenses, taxes and salaries specifically, also have a level setting where you can, for example, squeeze more taxes out your population at the cost of reduced legitimacy and increased radicalization. A massive hike of the tax level to the highest level is a surefire way to both raise money and create political radicals. So, here we got the budget. As you can see, we have an income tax, a poll tax, and a consumption tax. Now, the interesting thing about this, that the way this works is, of course, via a law and then via an institution. So basically, we have the basic income tax, and in this case, we have a payroll tax, which primarily focuses on the lower strata. If we were somebody that dislikes the upper strata more, we could just go more against them with a different law, with a different implementation of this. This gets rid of the government legitimacy, and it also makes it so that radicals from standard of livings decreasing will become more prominent, or rather more present. The predicted revenue, okay, change in revenue from current tax law, 74.8k. This is if we were to raise it to the maximum, I believe, right here from right over there. We got the consumption tax, and this is goods specific, I believe. So in this case, we have no goods that we are taxing in particular. Then we got the dividends tax, minting money from investment fund, diplomatic pacts, and additional income. So diplomatic pacts is something that I have been thinking about a lot. It could, of course, be vassalization. It could be reparations from wars. But what I would also be interested in is where exactly are tariffs listed here? Like, where exactly are we looking in a situation where I have a diplomatic pact with another market to open up that market of a specific good? Is that a diplomatic pact? I could see that, and then you have a different menu just for the tariff setting there. Either way, quite, you know, straightforward. I think this is very much excellent the way it works. The interesting thing here for sure is that we're looking at different tax levels, right? And we can do this without needing the approval of anybody, apparently. Look at this. There's no approval. You can just move it as you feel fit. Interesting. Now, the general effect, of course, of this law and the institution is still what exactly it is, right? But yeah, quite interesting that the tax level doesn't seem to be touched by needing to have it approved by the king, by the parliament, and so on and so forth. And then national expenses, new construction. I love that you can speed them up. I hope that you can speed them up just like one building, rather than, you know, hey, everything should be sped up and will cost us more. Currently, we're not building anything. Government wages, of course, yeah, okay, they're set to normal. Goods for government buildings that need to be purchased as well, and military wages, last but not least, and goods for military buildings. All of this, pretty cool, pretty straightforward. I think it works. I genuinely believe this is a good solution compared to what we had in Victoria 2. Main types of income, not an exhaustive list. Minting. All countries can generate some cash flow by printing or casting new currency in relation to the GDP. Minting provides all countries with some income, particularly those who have domestic goldfields, but it is in itself insufficient for funding anything but the most minimalist of governments. A form of taxation collected on income, that is the income tax, where a certain percentage of the wages paid to workers in buildings is paid to the government. Poll taxes, a form of per capita taxation where a fixed sum of money is collected on each member of the workforce. Poll taxes are very regressive since they collect the same amount regardless of income. Land taxes, a special type of poll taxes that are only collected on certain types of pops, such as peasants. Consumption taxes, a tax that is levied directly on a specific good, makes sense. Levying consumption taxes costs authority. Interesting. Dividend taxes, a tax that is applied to dividends paid to pops with an ownership stake in a building, tends to be a very progressive form of taxation, as usually only well-to-do pops have ownership of buildings. And then tariffs. Tariffs are something that we plan to have in the game as a way to... Wait, we're not ready to talk about... Ah, here we go. We're not ready to talk about how exactly this will work. Fair enough. Expenses, government wages, makes sense. Government goods, makes sense. Military wages, yeah, all of these make sense. And then we have subsidies, so the cost of subsidizing specific buildings to ensure they remain competitive. Interest, the cost of making interest payments on your loans, if you have any. And then last but not least, construction. The cost of constructing new buildings, both in goods required for the method of construction, and wages paid to pops working in the construction industry. And that's it for this dev diary. We're gonna, of course, move on to last week's dev responses and community responses. Next dev diary will be standard of living. As for this dev diary, I have to say, yes, I'm thinking about the loans, you know, domestic and foreign loans. I'm thinking about that quite a bit. But in general, the way they approach loans and the way they approach the budget is much more healthy than Victoria 2, which isn't difficult because Victoria 2 was developed in like, a year roughly, and then half a year for the DLCs, or maybe a year as well. So 2 years maximum, let's phrase it like this. And it's not difficult to overcome that, but I think this is a new approach, a graduation, if you will, for, well, grand strategy in general. I think how money is approached and how your budget as a state is approached Definitely would like to see that elsewhere as well, in maybe EU5, something like that. Now, this was the dev diary today. Let me know what you think about it, but let's move on to last week's dev responses. Alright, so let's do the dev responses and then we're going to do the community responses. I want you to know, I skipped, of course, over a couple of dev responses where I think we are fine skipping them. I skipped over a number of, comments because there are so many great comments, but I think I could, the general sentiment, I guess, of the comments section right there. Now, let's start. How will the age mechanic work exactly? So this is in relation to a pop being able to read, and then at some point, if you don't educate that pop anymore, that pop being unable to read in the future, basically making it so that, of course, we're looking at, a generational loss of literacy. Is there some age pyramid, or will individual pops' ages be tracked? Man, I have to tell you, so it was apparent to me that the age pyramid wouldn't be a thing, but it would be cool as hell. It would be cool as hell. Obviously, pops are more abstracted. They don't actually work in an age pyramid. There's just an abstraction that they basically fade out, and that is, looked at as death of a pop, the latter. So basically, yeah, it's just they will die per year that is assumed, and in that case, the education goes down. There's a slight bias to choose the illiterate members of the pop when deaths are resolved, which could either represent the fact that the older members of your population tends to be more likely to be literate, or that they couldn't read the warning labels on the factory floor. Take your pick. But if a pop's education access decreases below their current literacy level, it doesn't matter how large that bias is, net literacy rate will still go down. I like that solution. I think it is abstract. Of course, there's not actually an age pyramid. There's not actually a pop of the age 70 dying, but instead it just assumes it in an abstract form, and I think it reaches the same result. Are the discrimination impacts on qualifications a replacement to the Victoria II ban on industry in colonial states? I've been wondering how colonies will work, and this seems to be a far more elegant mechanic. It's related to this, yes. During development, we also experimented with having hard requirements for certain professions, so the culturally discriminated could never turn into aristocrats, for example. But this led to huge problems in recently conquered colonial territories, where the newly discriminated could be robbed of their land holdings, with the result that conquered farms and plantations become completely non-operational until accepted pops at the time and will to move in to take over operation. Because, of course, in any building, you basically have a ratio depending on production methods and what building it is and so on. And in this case, you needed aristocrats that would be basically completely gone. I assume that basically the way it will work in Victoria 3 in terms of, actually achieving it is basically looking at a situation where you, for starters, still have old aristocrats in the place, and they will basically be pushed out by other aristocrats as you go forward. This sounds like a fun little side effect, but was actually anything but in practice. What happens under this system is that the cowed and discriminated aristocrats gradually lose their qualifications to be aristocrats under these new laws, and will over time be replaced by other pops deemed to be more suitable for the job. Yeah, makes perfect sense. Will pops have any bias in demotion? Right. This is something we want to get to that in the community responses. Demotion is no longer a thing. You need to envision this as yourself in the real world, and you have a job. I have this job, right? I'm also qualified to do other jobs. I'm qualified, obviously, for more menial tasks. I'm qualified because of what I've done for other jobs in the industry, for example, in the financial industry. And that qualification goes down and goes up based on my wealth, based on whether I can achieve, actually getting in on this, based on whether I can actually access this, based on whether I can read. And this, of course, would be applying to other people that are like me, my pop, if you will, right? So that is basically how it works. There's no longer a demotion. You can pivot to other jobs that pay less. That is possible, which technically is a demotion. You can pivot to these jobs if you lose your qualifications. So if I suddenly forget how to read, I will no longer be able to do YouTube. You may think you don't need to read for YouTube, but it's untrue. I need to write scripts, okay? So basically, that is a big part. But you could also simply, be demoted because, I don't know, somebody comes in and says, hey, this guy is Bavarian, no longer is allowed to have these jobs. We want to discriminate against them, right? That is an option. So, effectively, there is no per se demotion. No pop class is worse than another pop class, but pop classes are paid in different levels. So, professions, depending on your life circumstance, depending on your state, depending on your nation, will have different states of wage, and that wage will determine whether you as a pop want to be that. For you personally, something might be a downgrade, but technically speaking, you're just sort of sidelining yourself. You're going to a different direction, right? That is the idea here. Demotion as such doesn't happen in the system. What happens is that an underpaid aristocrat will take any job they qualify for as long as it pays better. That's basically what it is. So it's more likely that an aristocrat will take a machinist job. I did mispronounce it, by the way. Machinist, sorry. Machinist, not mechanist. I misread that, straight up misread that in the last dev diary. A machinist job at a very profitable factory, then become a farmer on a pretty humdrum wheat farm, and vice versa. So this is why so originally when I was looking at the last dev diary, I said to myself, this change doesn't seem that great. And then I thought about it. And this is a huge degree, seriously, this is not me exaggerating. I believe this. Fundamentally, this is a huge change when it comes to the flexibility of pops and when it comes to how you view your pops. No longer are you looking at this and say, oh, I really need these laborers to rise up and, you know, become all these craftsmen to rise up and, I don't know, become clerks, become bureaucrats, become, for example, capitalists. Because these jobs, of course, they differ, but they do different things. But for your nation, you need all of them. And as your pop, you will take whatever pays more. If you're an aristocrat, and you make no money because you're being persecuted, for example, you're looking at a situation where you might want to become a machinist if you fulfill that qualification, right? Obviously, yeah, you might still have the framework, hey, I used to be an aristocrat and life was good, but you were basically, you call it Lumpenaristokratie, where you basically had no money, you were poor, you had nothing to do with your options, with normal options of aristocrats. You could not do this, and that is why you had to become something else. Now, some of these mechanics seem to represent only a capitalistic free-wage market. Will cooperative or command economies be treated any differently, especially with the competition part and how they employ people? I want to stress here as well that command economies fundamentally, of course, reject the idea of the price being the indicator for how much a good is worth and how much a good is desired and supplied, which does come with very specific troubles in the real world. The price is one of the best natural indicators if it is not influenced from other sides like cartels and whatnot, right? Obviously, there's never an ideal state in the real market, so most of the time you have somebody that is tinkering with the price in a way that shouldn't be allowed. But of course, command economies function differently. Many command economies, not all of them, but most command economy designs basically devolve in a way where the price is no longer accurate to any degree, and that is difficult because it makes it difficult to determine what the demand of a good actually is. Let's take a look at this. Great question. Currently, there is no direct impact from the command economy law on qualifications or how pops are preferentially sorted with when hiring them. Qualification is best thought of as a mishmash of could this pop literally carry out this particular profession given their current attributes, and would other pops in the country actually hire this pop for this profession given their current attributes? The first part of that equation doesn't really change under command economy or cooperative forms of economic organization. Yeah, of course not. You're qualified or you're not qualified. You absolutely need a certain level of education to become an academic or engineer, and the greater the number of people who know how to read and write, the greater the chance one of them will have the talents and tendencies to perform those jobs well. As for the second part, I'm not sure it'd make a difference either. People tend to be, well, people regardless of economic system, and people have biases about who they think would be a credible farm boy or clerk or military officer, so it's entirely possible laws like those will end up making a difference to qualification calculations before Victoria 3 is released. These numbers and factors aren't final, but even so, it probably won't make a huge impact. I feel like that is fine as far as I'm concerned. I think the biggest thing that we need to keep in mind is that the command economy should fundamentally change how you supply or how you look at supply and demand and how that impacts your nation's wallet, your state's wallet. What does change the equations quite a bit is more egalitarian access to the factors that produce qualifications. In a liberal and non-discriminatory society with a public school system and low wealth disparity, pops will accumulate qualifications a lot more equally on account of having more similar properties than in a discriminatory and stratified society. Yeah, that makes sense, of course. But I do think, basically, the impact of a command economy shouldn't necessarily be felt by who gets hired, unless they are of the wrong ideology, for example. That is something I could see, realistically speaking. But rather, should be based on the idea, and I mean that can be solved via discrimination. If you want to discriminate people that love the free market on a gameplay level, right? You basically have to go and you just add a -10 modifier. Then they won't qualify. They won't pivot towards that qualification, and you can put people in that are loyal to the party, for example. But I do think that you should see a major impact in how the actual economy works when it comes to the numbers, the demand and supply. But honestly, that remains to be seen. We will have to see how that goes in the actual gameplay. Now, I see that the steel mills are promoting machinists and engineers from qualified pops, but losing, I swear, if machinist, by the way, is also a wrong pronunciation, I'm going to lose my mind, but losing engineers to the work industry too quickly. So if the steel mills are gaining machinists, but losing engineers, that will make their production method recipes stop working as well. So then they'll raise wages for engineers eventually. Do buildings raise wages for different jobs at different rates? I hope you'll be able to prevent the systems from locking up, for example, having a factory lose all its engineers, and then having their budget deep in the red on account of inefficient machinists still drawing wages. Buildings have a general wage rate, and professions have a wage weight that determines how large of a multiple of that rate they should get. I like that. So wages paid out are always proportional based on those weights. A building that needs more engineers and finds it can attract them based on their low wage rate will raise the wage rate generally, not only for engineers. The latter would be cool, but there's too many moving parts already. Yeah, I think they would destroy everybody's CPU. With respect to the latter question, buildings will always aim for proportionality between professions. If a factory loses all its engineers and can't promote machinists or other professions to take over, it will start letting go of other employees until it returns to proportionality and profitability and can start competing again to get some of those engineers back. Let's be frank here. A wage increase for the pilots that work for a company that, you know, is an airplane company. Their wage increase does not necessarily correspond to a wage increase for the facility managers of that company. For the stewardess, if that is the plural, which it probably isn't. Stewardesses. Flight attendants. There we go, that's the better word. Flight attendants. But, for the sake of the simulation that Victoria 3 has, where primarily it needs a working system, I do believe that this system is acceptable. I hope that as technology, and I'm talking about real-world computing technology, increases and gets better, we may actually see a difference there as well, where a company, or rather a factory building can say, or a building can say, I will pay you more because I need more of you and you're not coming, and I can pay you less because you don't have any other opportunities. I think that should be an option. I do think this is currently handled indirectly by the game basically saying, hey, if you're underpaying them, they're just gonna see, you know, they're gonna go somewhere else. They're gonna maybe starve. They're gonna become radicalized, that sort of stuff, right? So it still is addressed to a degree, but yeah, no, certainly. I mean, we also, at that point, we need to talk, and I mean, this gets even more complex if we think about it. Obviously, we have companies, and companies don't exist in Victoria 3 to the degree that we look at them in the real world when it comes to know, hey, this company exists and manipulates the price, so this company exists and gets gobbled up by a different company, and so on and so forth. Doesn't exist. But we also have to look at trade unions. In Germany, most of the trade unions that exist, and this is something that is solved and talked about and instituted in the constitution of Germany. In Germany, if you are basically a trade union, you're looking at a situation where you have to be a trade union for all the employees in that business. That is the base idea. We have some niche trade unions these days that are, for example, only for doctors, only for pilots, only for train operators. But the base idea of German unions, because of the constitutional duty that is in the Constitution of Germany, is to say we need a solidarity between the pilots and the facility managers, between the flight attendants and the facility managers and the pilots, between the engineers and all of these people. That is the base idea. Meaning that different countries, looking at the US, for example, looking at the UK, looking at France, looking at Germany, looking at Spain, looking at Italy, and so on and so forth, may have different understandings of how a trade union should work in the first place. And I do think that representing that, similar to companies, would be cool. Just wanted to push that in there. You know, hey, obviously it's not going to be in. I think that's fine. I think trade unions, as they are currently represented in the game, work because they become political, they become motivated, they will attract different pops based on who those pops are, what their legacy is, so to speak, where they come from, where they go, and so on. But I will say, would be cool if we had a different approach for different trade unions. Either way. Since they are an interest group, it's a generalized idea anyway. These are all trade unions regardless of who they really are. Now, let's talk about 1 and 2. Pops who don't have the correct type for professions have malices. Does it mean that education facilities promote pop types before they enter the workforce if you have it? Pops who don't have the qualification for a profession cannot get hired for that profession. All profession changes occur at a point of hire driven by market forces. So, you become an engineer because you're qualified to be an engineer and somebody's hiring you to be an engineer. That's how it goes. Is there a cap as with Victoria 2, so the optimal things? No. It's all based on the requirement of the buildings as defined by their active production methods. So yes, in the factories or in the buildings, there are basically requirements, proportional situations of how many pops you want of this type and of that type, but it depends on the production method, it depends on the building. It's not like Victoria 2. Victoria 2 was incredibly simple compared to what is going on there. Does urbanization mechanic encourage pops to move into these factories from the rural countryside? Only if those factories are more profitable and therefore be capable of paying higher wages and the rural population qualify. Do national focuses work the same way? No, we have decrees. We already talked about that like ages ago. And there's a decree to promote social mobility, which helps build qualifications in a state generally. But there's no encourage profession X type national focus, as this is driven by the needs of the buildings. And also, encourage pop type in Victoria 2 was a waste of time. Was there anything else here? Yes. Is there any distinction in the aristocrat and capitalist profession from other professions? Does a building production method need these professions to operate? How does that correlate with the not yet completely explained mechanic that these pops provide the investment pool to build these buildings in the first place? I would assume that those pops are the owners and the buildings they financed. Obviously, there's a level of abstraction going on here, but it seems strange to me that, for example, more people qualified to be capitalists are promoted because a factory needs more owners. If that's the case, that does not what does the need for capitalists in a factory represent? Intuitively, I would say a factory runs just as well. Well, here's the thing, and I'm not sure about the response here either, but like, what I think Martin Anwart, so Wiz explained this last Dev Diary, I believe. Basically, the fundamental idea here is that one building represents an entire sector in a city. If I have a building that is driven by shopkeepers and they sell things, that building is actually a huge variety of different stores, right? So being an owner essentially just means I'm taking over a store, or I'm opening up a store. That is all it means in the sense of buildings in Victoria 3. Again, sadly, we don't actually have companies. They're just, you know, all of the stores are assumed to be perfectly rational individual actors that are going on there. Again, very abstracted, very simplified, but less simplified than Victoria 2, still. And let's read the answer. Aristocrats and capitalists are required, and they are required proportionally to the other professions in the building. While that is arguably unrealistic, how many aristocrats do you really need to own the land for people to work productively, after all? But there's unfortunate side effects from not doing it this way, such as farms full of laborers, but no aristocrats to siphon off the profits, being able to pay astronomical wages. And then when some aristocrats move in and take over the land, the building is suddenly deep in the red, because the aristocrats need to get paid their share. This then leads to metas, where the factor that developed qualifications for aristocrats are artificially throttled to ensure simple farms provide amazing wages without having to engage in any form of ownership reform. This disproportionality between professions tend to throw the whole balance off, so we avoid it like the plague. Regarding capitalist investments, it helps to think of a building as an industrial... Yeah, there we go. Does the fact that a pop is qualified to promote to a more socially prestigious profession but lacks the economic conditions to do so play a role in other sections of the game? For example, imagine there are a lot of machinists who are qualified to promote to engineer, but the country currently does not have any additional jobs for engineers. Does the game consider promoting from machinist? Honestly, don't ask me. To engineer something... Okay. How does the being unable to do it but actually fulfilling the circumstances, how does that influence people? Does that, have an impact on immigration, unhappiness, and so on? In Victoria 3, pops never change profession unless a building offers them a job different than what they currently have. In this, pops are perfectly rational actors and will only take jobs that pay better regardless of perceived social status. However, with increased pay tends to come more political strength and other benefits, so that dimension isn't completely ignored either. Yeah, concerning wages, will trade unions and strike actions be represented in some way? The trade unions is an interest group present in every country. It tends to be weak at game start, but often become very relevant in industrializing nations. Makes sense. Regarding strikes, that will happen, but more on that later. Are the Rockefellers and so on, something that is shown? That's not going to be modeled systemically, at least, because it's no fun as a player to lay the tracks and build the infrastructure for a new steel mill, and if the existing steel mill owners decide that production won't be increased because that might lead to them becoming individually less wealthy. I don't agree. I get why they're doing it. It's a complication that doesn't need to be done to get a working system. I understand that, and I agree with it, but I don't agree that having to fight or compromise with private owners is something that can't be fun. I think it can be fun. Absolutely. I think it should be in the game. It's more realistic. But I will say again, I'm sort of stepping off the gas when it comes to these sort of topics. I want a working system, as I made clear ages ago. And I think, hey, if it's a bit more abstract, if it's a bit more simplified, but works, and is less simplified than Victoria 2, I'm on board. So, yeah, basically, that's my take on this. Why are there no artisans? Modeled in another way. Interesting. Don't know what that means, but interesting. Do buildings in the red only reduce wages, or do they also lay off workers? The latter would seem to be a better simulation of individual firms represented by the building going bust and firms downsizing to reduce costs. So basically, the response here is that you're looking at a situation where layoffs do happen, but voluntarily. And that sounds stupid, but basically what it means is, if your company is performing poorly, you will lower your wages, meaning that your jobs are actually less attractive for pops, meaning that pops will leave for other jobs, or go, migrate away, become unemployed in that migrated away territory, that sort of stuff. And I think, honestly, in this case, I'm not even going to say I would like to see it in a different way, like I did with the trade unions, like I did with the topic above right here, with the topic of companies and conglomerates, that sort of stuff. But I will say, I think this is completely adequate. The result is the same. Yes, these people are migrating away voluntarily. They're working for a different company voluntarily, but they are in a situation where we basically have a situation where it's like they were being laid off. They just immediately found something better, which is not necessarily realistic, but the result is basically the same. It's an abstracted version of this result. If you have a situation where your entire, economy goes into the gutter, you have a situation where they won't be finding different where they won't be finding a different opportunity, making it so that they might lose qualifications because they can't access, healthcare. They can't access, let's say, for example, what was I going to say here? Education, so they would lose literacy, might even lose qualification, and could then be unemployed all of a sudden. It could happen. So the way I see this, the result is what is needed. The actual theory behind this approach is not realistic, but it comes out with the result that we need, so I'm okay with it. Let's skip all of these, let's move on. There's only a couple more that I wanted to talk about, there we go. In real life, most socialist economies subsidize full or almost full employment, even if a given factory is unprofitable. Will this be simulated in the game? The GDR, for example, did this. Unemployment was basically illegal. You had a duty to work, and you would be working. Can you spend your national treasury on this? I mean, that's actually not true. There were subcultures that weren't working at the time, but just saying in general. We'll talk more about this later, but in short, this is simulated via the way subsidy mechanics work in a command economy. You're correct that some of the fundamental distinctions between capitalist and communist systems of organizing the economy cannot be captured with our market mechanics, since it's completely driven by supply and demand. As I said, goods prices don't play a role in an actual command economy. We can both talk about the GDR, for example, there, but we can also talk about the Nazi German war economy, not the economy before that, but the war economy very much was a command economy, led to a lot of black markets because supply and demand were not actually matched and were unable to be matched because since it was a directed economy, you were inefficient and this inefficiency was shown. One of the more common ways that I hear these days is the topic of computer algorithms, basically finding supply and demand and then finding how you can approach that demand with a supply that is given with the state resources, but that is an esoteric philosophical question, doesn't really matter for the moment. All it does mean is that price no longer can fulfill its role as an indicator, and that is not simulated in Victoria 3's market economy system in ways that don't make a clear distinction between sales price and value. Yeah, basically. I, again, still think it's important. I don't know. I hope that they do Dev Diary basically just on market, or rather on command economies. I would be a big fan of this. Out of scope of this Dev Diary, but how does this interact with pops out of the state, right? Will they migrate in? And the answer is no, because it would be too CPU heavy. They don't check for that. Basically, it's just in one state. But if a state is very rich, if they pay good wages, they will have a higher standard of living and people will still migrate there. So, similar to what I said earlier, this isn't how it works in real life, but the result comes from an abstract point of view, but reaches the level of result that we want. So, essentially, yes. Does work that way, but doesn't work that way. Right. I'm afraid you're implying ownership is not present in the game, and it is only a title without any effect. If owners double every time the employers double, this means owners are only employees. Ownership should come from selling shares of companies to investors. Yeah, well, again, not simulated, sadly, right? Rather than owners, we speak of shareholders in Victoria 3. Any pops in a building can also be shareholders in that building. The amount per pop typically determined by its ownership production method. So, yeah, if you have something that is a co-op owned one, then all the workers will own it. If you don't have a co-op owned one, then the aristocrats, the capitalists will own it, and so on and so forth. Dividends are split between pops in relation to the number of shares they hold, and the building's cash reserve is also considered to be owned, albeit in an illiquid manner, but the shareholders in proportion to their shares. This lets us represent many different forms of ownership types, investments, etc. I think that's a good approach. I think it works. What it does not let us do is represent unlimited snowballing accumulation of capital in individuals, as you point out, particularly across several industrial sectors. In its current form, shares in a building can only be owned by pops in the building's workforce, including capitalists, aristocrats, etc. This implies that, for example, capitalists actually do some meaningful work, and so on. This is not completely representative of reality, and is a bit of an idealized take on how market economies operate in practice. Yeah, it certainly is. Sponsored by the Nestle concern. But there are several gameplay benefits to using this model and its representation as a default behavior. Snowballing accumulation of capital can still be modeled by reducing the number of available capitalist job opportunities in a building under certain conditions, and it's not out of the question that something like that will make it in. But I can't say I'm feeling the lack of this in-game right now. Capitalists tend to get plenty powerful industrializing nations, even without the ability to snowball their capital. Yeah, that's basically it, right? I want companies because I think it would be fun to interact with them. Doesn't have to be, but I think it can be fun to interact with them on a positive or a negative manner. But I think the current system works, and that is just more important to me personally. You may disagree, let me know in the comments. That's how I feel about it. I want companies, but yeah, hey, as long as, you know, capitalists become important and I still need to deal with them, even if it isn't Rockefeller and his oil empire, right? It's fine. If I still need to deal with a guy like Rockefeller, I'm on board. All pops are differentiated by profession, culture, religion, workplace. One has to be careful when adding more of any of the categories as the number of pops that one has to... Right, this is modding. You know what, honestly, it doesn't... I'm gonna get rid of it. Get the modding out of here. Let's move on to the last section of this, and that is, of course, the absolutely wonderful community responses. Let's check it out. Alright, and with that, let's get to the comment responses under the last video. So that was, you know, when it comes to professions of pops and employment and so on and so forth. I just finished a tabletop session, so now I am here. The other parts of the video were recorded before that. Let's talk about the first one here. The dev diary is so misleading. First, change from pop type to to pop profession is just a renaming, nothing more. Pools of pops who are qualified for a different job are an awesome mechanic. Expanded tooltips are offering much better transparency of and underlying codes. I will probably stop reading the configs while playing, but they're just expanded tooltips, not a revolution in pop promotion or demotion mechanic. Second and most important, all this dev diary is about promotion, not about change of profession. I haven't seen a single word about pop demotion. What happens to a pop if you close the factory or change its production type? That requires less engineers. Third, just for fun, pool of clerics that are eager to become engineers. That's pathetic. So, this is obviously a comment that I disagree with, but I think it's still a valid point in the sense that I very much felt the same way when I read the last dev diary the first time. I said to myself, this is kind of like not that different, right? But once you look at it from not the Victoria 2 lens, but from a new lens, I think it becomes quickly apparent, at least it did to me. If it doesn't to you, then that's fair, and I would ask you to further make a case in the comments if you feel differently about this. I think if you put yourself into the frame of demotion and promotion, no, this doesn't seem different, but in reality, these terms no longer apply. We saw that today in the dev responses as well, in last week's dev responses, but primarily, basically, this is simply a different system. This is not the same at all. There is no promotion and demotion because, hey, yeah, technically, you might go from engineer to just being a laborer, but you would be earning more as the laborer, and on top of that, you now have this sort of interflinging motivation there where the qualifications of pops are significantly more important than in Victoria 2. I personally do not at all think that this is just a renaming process. I can see it in the fundamentals because, of course, yeah, changing jobs and having qualifications, yeah, it did technically exist in Victoria 2, but nowhere near with the same granularity, nor with the same idea that you becoming an engineer is actually a negative. None of that is anymore the case. Before in Victoria 2, as they said themselves in the dev diary, in the last dev diary, so not today's, but last ones, they most certainly were in a position where you had optimal ratios for your entire nation, and you certainly had optimal ratios just when it comes to certain pop types that you really didn't want in your country because they just weren't good. That is no longer at all the case. As far as I'm concerned, this is a big change. The second one, not about change of profession. We talked about this, I think, in particular today about the topic when it comes to the dev responses. There was a lot of talk there as far as promotion and demotion, or rather, sorry, profession changes go, how they're triggered, what they represent, and so on and so forth. So I think we already covered that. And then pool of clerics that are eager to become engineers. I don't know. Why not? If it pays more, if they actually believe that, you know, they can't actually hold on to their wealth, to their very existence as clerics, then why not? That's all I can say. I fundamentally disagree with number 1 and number 2. Now, number 3, yeah, I mean, I don't know. If there's something where you could have something that they generally change their profession, you know, in a larger amount of time, if they are clerics, because they truly believe in what they do, I get that. But at the same time, we are in a position here where most things that occur are driven by their realistic situation, financially speaking. That is what drives most people. If you cannot afford to be a cleric, then you will not be a cleric. That's just the way it is. But it actually does, and this goes a bit further away from this comment, but it does bring in something interesting. We talk about companies a lot, and we're going to be talking about companies, but I actually like the idea of saying the church pays these people. Independent of your economy, the church pays these people. I think that could be cool, but it's currently not in the game whatsoever from what we know. Now let's move on, if I may. Here we go. When do you think Victoria 3 will be released and written right here in German? My answer before and today, I just brought this in basically to give an answer. My answer effectively is I believe we're talking about Q3, Q4, 2022. Maybe it's going to be Q2. I don't think it's going to be Q1 at all. Maybe it's going to be Q2 or Q3, Q4. More likely 3 or 4. And that's just my estimate, of course. I don't know anything that you don't know. Honestly, I feel like you're overhyping this. It's a bit more transparent on what's happening, and there are more modifiers affecting promotion, but it's not revolutionary. See, yeah, much like with the first comment, I just fundamentally disagree. I think the way pops work now, that they have a history of what they were, what they can do, and that they have qualifications, it makes them much more flexible, and most importantly, it makes it so that you as the player don't look at them, oh, this is wasted potential. You know, if I have too many bureaucrats, it does nothing. No, in this case, it's more about, do you have the qualification for bureaucrats? Should the old bureaucrats be phasing out? It is significantly different from Victoria 2, at least in my point of view. I don't think that, you know, you can just say it just has more modifiers affecting promotion, because there is no promotion anymore. You can be a laborer and be better off than an aristocrat if that aristocrat is in a bad position. But, you know, changing on a lateral scale, so to speak, you know, going from aristocrat to capitalist, it is all in a very different manner than in Victoria 2, where it was all straightforward. You had a capitalist, they had a very specific function that occurred at all times as long as they were present, as long as you weren't a command economy, so as long as you weren't socialist or communist. That is no longer the case. It works significantly differently now. Let's move on. Yes, we saw the pop professions, but the pops are male. What about women's suffrage and child labor? So the answer is we have dependents now in Victoria 3. This is another big change. I personally am a huge fan of this. Basically, your dependents, so your children and so on, they exist, they do their thing, they don't work naturally, so women in most societies don't work naturally either, but if you change your laws, their efficiency and their actual entrance into the workforce can occur, can increase, and make it so that you end up with a better population, with a population that is more efficient, that has just more people working in general. So they are represented, and they will also be in a position where they can be vital, in particular after a war. If you lose a bunch of people in a war, then you might be looking at a situation where, you know, those people that were in that war don't come back, but maybe their women now need to start working, their wives. And I think that could be interesting, or rather will be interesting. How that actually plays out, though, is of course something that needs to be seen in the actual gameplay. While I doubt companies will be in the game at launch, they sound like something that will be perfect with the focus of a major DLC. Imagining a new system that spawned companies as your nation industrialized, some time of which would have historical names based on the country they spawn in. I could see an interface for tracking the companies within your nation, similar to the one for interest groups. Companies could have types, a CEO, political leanings, and goals. I could also imagine a map mode for companies showing you which states they have economic control over and where they are attempting to expand into next. This could have interesting effects on gameplay. Massive monopolies that maximize profits above all else could cause massive unrest among laborers, leading you to wage a political battle to bust the trust, so ignore and potentially face a worker uprising. Cartels could significantly undermine your ability to collect taxes and gather resources in states they control. Oil companies could unite to collectively drive up the price of oil on a global scale. Heck, you may even have an ambitious CEO that is so rich that they try to buy their way to being the leader of a nation. Just my thought, but I do think an entire system for a company is perfect for a DLC. Imagine something like Stellaris' Megacorp expansion, but way more fleshed out. I don't disagree. I think this is actually a really neat idea to have a bit of a, you know, maybe an undermining of an interest group, you know, something like that. The industrialists basically get split up and then look into what interest group they want to support, what they're interested in. You have companies and they actually hold basically a grip over a state. I think that could be appropriate, primarily because even if you introduce companies, the problem that I see with it on a fundamental mechanical level is the idea that the buildings that you have in the game aren't actually able to simulate companies. I don't think they will ever be able to simulate that. I think at most you will be able to actually show companies owning an entire building rather than splitting buildings up further, which would be how companies actually work. You know, a building is a sector of an industry, but if you have actual companies, genuine, like small companies, then that sector, that building would need to be split up. I think that doesn't really work with the game design, you know, strategy here that they have chosen, meaning that what you would have to do, you would have to start with cartels on a grander scale, so on a state scale, for example, I don't dislike this idea at all. I think this is an interesting idea. There's a shifting in the PDX's games in the building systems to an abstract representation, a group of buildings instead of a realistic one. So this is a yes and for me, basically. I agree and I disagree. I do think that this is partially true. I think that this is, when we look at CK3's buildings, and I think CK3's buildings, just for the record, are significantly better than CK2's buildings, we're looking at a situation where they did definitely do that. They sort of collapsed buildings into one another, instead of having X million buildings like you had in CK2 that you did not ever care about. You have building slots and fewer buildings. But I will also say that I don't think this is genuinely true on a certain level, because Victoria 2's factories were not realistic. They were much like the districts that Victoria 3's factories now are. It's effectively the same thing, except Victoria 3 properly acknowledges it. In Victoria 2, listen, if you had a textile mill running around and doing its stuff right, that was not one textile mill. That was an entire sector of textile mills. Listen, when it comes to companies, I think, when it comes to buildings, Victoria 2 was significantly less complex compared to Victoria 3's system as it is presented. You know, who knows how it turns out, but mind you, I think basically the way it is presented is significantly more complex, because they actually come in with an angle where buildings in different states that are the same factory on a technical level actually use different production and ownership methods, making it so that they work differently. Not a thing in Victoria 2. I think we actually, when it comes to the Victoria series, you have an expansion of complexity. I do think that you could be more granular, more modular when it comes to the actual buildings in Victoria 3, but I think that this is a step up. But it is in line with a certain degree of streamlining that, again, doesn't allow for companies to own, particular buildings within a state, and then multiple companies own that, because it's always a sector rather than literally just one building, one business, one company. Perhaps companies trying to undermine each other with unfair business strategies could be represented with a kind of centralization score. So, for instance, with a low centralization score, you have a lot of small businesses, most of whom just play fair, and the ones who don't are drowned out by the masses. However, if something happens that suddenly interrupts the market, like, say, a particularly bad harvest causes a spike in grain prices that suddenly puts a lot of mills out of business, the centralization rises, as the businesses that survive end up buying the perfectly operational infrastructure up for their own use. This, of course, shifts the market more towards the monopoly, which comes with its own set of benefits and disadvantages. Perhaps every country could even have a list of big companies and various businesses that employ people in various sectors, who control some amount of the industry in any particular state. Of course, these companies could be great friends to the government and help them achieve various goals, or they could be the type of company that are the reason that antitrust laws exist. Or maybe even a bit of both. I, for one, would love to see giant companies represented as a political entity, including trust busting and the like. I agree. I think the issue with companies is, and this is something, a philosophy that will help you in general, I think, understanding grand strategy games. Modern grand strategy games try to bind things together in a central node. CK3 brings everything back to the characters. They bring everything back to character interactions. Hey, if you have rebellions, there is a good reason that there is a genuine leader for this. If you have interactions with factions, you interact with the people individually. When you have the royal court, you will be interacting with people individually in that court as well. That is the base idea of CK3. In Victoria 3, everything comes back to pops. If you have a company in Victoria 3, if you had a company, you would have to bind that company to pops to a certain degree. I don't know how that would work. I don't disagree with this post at all. I'm just saying I think it is more complex than we all imagine, because they clearly have a design vision that always goes back to one central element where everything comes together. In this case, your society, your pops. And honestly, I think that's where the main difficulty is. You can have influence zones of companies. You can have influence zones that, are over several states, that are just within a state, so the state itself is split. You get benefits, you get disadvantages. But the question is, how does this affect my pops, I think? I hope that they get it done. But honestly, we'll have to see how it goes all in all. And this was today's Dev Diary. We did the dev responses, we did the comment responses. The Dev Diary today, for me personally, was very satisfying. I think this is a better system than what we had in Victoria 2 to a significant degree as well. Now, of course, this does make it so. I think what we're looking at fundamentally is that the idea of companies could be very difficult to implement. And probably more importantly, the idea of currencies is effectively no longer a thing. Because you purchasing gold basically goes into nothingness. It's an open economy, right? You're not buying your gold reserves from anybody. It's just a stockpile that you accumulate by having a surplus. And I think that is fine, but I do think that that essentially will make it impossible to have different currencies, which is something that they stated before. I want to make that clear as well. I'm mostly mentioning this so that nobody gets any illusions. We're not going to see currencies from the way this game is designed from the ground up. I don't think, and this is I don't have any evidence for this, of course, but I think fundamentally from the game design perspective, I think companies may be possible. I don't think currencies are actually going to ever make it into the game, because the fundamental level of money and the way it works is designed in a way where currency would be really just a negative. I don't think there's a positive that can be drawn from that. I'm very concerned, or rather, I'm rather concerned about the idea of foreign loans. Maybe that is still a thing, it's just not listed in this, but so far it hasn't been listed, so yeah. What did you think? Let me know about it in the comments, and I would like to thank all of the members of the channel, namely the barons, the counts, and the dukes. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you later, alligator.